Welcome, everybody. For those who do not know, I'm Dr. Megan Clark. I am an associate professor in the theology department, but I'm also the faculty co-chair of our St. John's Catholic Relief Services Global Campus Committee. And while our lectures that have been planned have been interrupted by the coronavirus, we are glad to welcome Dr. Rowlands virtually so that she can still share and we can use this resource while we are navigating being online for the next couple of weeks. Dr. Anna Rowlands is the St. Hilda Associate Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. A political theologian and expert on Catholic social teaching with special interests in the work of Hannah Arendt and Gillian Rose, Dr. Rowland works on theology and migration and has done so for over a decade. She holds degrees in social and political science and theology from Cambridge University, the University of London, and Manchester University. She is the author and co-author of 2 forthcoming books. She is currently working on an AHRC ESRC Global Challenge funded research, the Refugee Host Project, focusing on forced displacement in the Middle East, and examines the role that faith and faith-based organizations play in local responses to displacement. She is also currently working on a project on immigration, destitution, and detention with the Jesuit Refugee Services. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Anna Rowlands.
Thank you, Professor Clark. I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm absolutely delighted that at least the technology is still working. And I'm really looking forward to having this opportunity to talk through with you some of the work that I've been doing in fieldwork settings, mainly in London, but also a little in the Middle East over the course of the last few years. So I'm going to deliver the talk that I had prepared for you, and then there are a few slides to go with it where I'm giving some quotations because they're a little bit longer and it gives you a chance to have a look at them. And then there'll be some activities and discussion questions that I've given to Professor Clark that she can use with you if you choose. So, the title for my talk today, Contesting Immigration Detention, St. Augustine and Simone Weil on the Problem of Force. I'm going to talk, first of all, using these 2 main quotations that you've got on the slides. So the first is a quote from Williams, who's describing St. Augustine's approach to evil. Quote, "Talking about evil is talking about a process, about something that happens to the things that there are in the universe. Evil is not some kind of object, so we might render the phrase from the City of God, but we give the name of evil to that process in which the good is lost." End of quote. And my second opening quotation comes from Simone Weil's writings in the 1940s. Quote, "The essential contradiction of the human condition is that man is subject to force and craves for justice. He is subject to necessity and craves for the good. It is not his body alone that is thus subject, but all his thoughts as well. And yet, man's very being consists in straining towards the good." End of quote. These quotations, one from former Archbishop of Canterbury, Williams, describing St. Augustine's approach to evil, and the other from mid-20th century philosopher Simone Weil, have become 2 of the most significant fragments of thought for me over the last 5 years. I have lived with them, turned them over in my mind, sought to find their relation. I'm starting my lecture today by sharing them with you because everything I will say circles around them. They frame my thinking about a critical political subject that has come to be one of the now very many political crises that we face in our times. I will name this crisis not a migration or refugee crisis, but rather a crisis in our politics of membership, in the practices that we are employing to decide questions of obligation, rights, belonging, membership, and exclusion. I will speak in this way for the following reasons. Firstly, because whilst there are political, economic and environmental crises, certainly, that are pushing the movement of peoples, the movement of peoples itself is not a crisis. It is a response, often a rational and good-seeking response to a complex set of factors. It's also worth bearing in mind that the challenge we face at the moment in terms of migration includes a crisis of immobility, not simply one of mobility, and the crisis of immobility is politically produced. My second reason for talking about a crisis in the politics of membership. The crisis of membership, who belongs and on what basis, is related to wider questions of race, geography, and religion that remain a critical part of our current political landscape. Questions of migration are also about all of these things. My third reason for talking about the politics of membership and our crisis thereof. Questions of religion relate to these questions of membership, not as external systems of ethics that might bring some wisdom to bear. In other words, oh, so what does religion have to say about migration? But rather, religion is right at the heart of these things already. Over the course of the last decade, the categories of religion, migration, violence, security, and terror have become increasingly entwined in our political discourse. We cannot easily separate them. In fact, arguably this is not new, and it relates not just to migrants, but to a permanently unstable relation of religion and the political in the West. My fourth reason for talking less about a migration crisis and more about a crisis in our politics of membership or belonging. We think we live in a secular age in which religion is a legitimate but largely private matter. In fact, religious ideas appear in public discourse all the time. We don't need an election cycle to prove that to us. Public speech deploys its own secular political theologies. Derived from a Christian heritage, we use public languages of blessing and sacrifice, of good and evil, of worthy and unworthy, of the chosen and the damned. As my colleague, Professor Elena Fidian-Cosme argues, in the context of migration, these categories relate to the perceived quiescence of migrants to cultural narratives of agency, dependency, and self-determination. Women, children, and those who remain in camps or urban settlements are often perceived as vulnerable and therefore more deserving migrants. Those who exercise forms of self-determination and decision to exercise agency themselves, while this is often seen as a way to enable politicians to explain to their populations that such individuals have placed themselves beyond rights regimes, beyond acceptable norms of protection and responsibility. This is problematic. Fifthly, so religion, theology, and faith are more than mere politics. They are also a source of truth, joy, transcendence, resilience, meaning-making, structured lament, and moral imagination for both those on the move or those trapped in immobility. They are also the basis for gathering and refashioning those persons and communities fractured by borders, to help us learn again, beyond and within nation states, how to live well together. The we who do theology includes refugees who bring religion, theology, and faith back to us from their own experiences of loss, everyday survival, and solidarity, and from the God who is found on the journey. The religious we, therefore, that reflects together on questions of migration crosses over every border and reconfigures it. It's therefore significant to me that Augustine and Simone Weil, who I draw upon today, 16 centuries apart, are writers whose thinking about politics and theology was deeply affected by the collapse of one world order and the waiting anxiously on another, and also by the mass movement of peoples. They knew about religion and race and biopolitical ordering of the world. Both wrote in a world of refugeedom or displacements, one from the fall of the Roman world and the other from the collapse of Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and both wrote about the search for and the loss of basic human goods that make our life together worth living. I'm using Augustine and Weil's work here in dialogue with fieldwork that I've conducted in refugee support projects and with former immigration detainees and in refugee camp situations over the last 5 years in the UK and the Middle East. Mostly I'm focusing here today on work done in the UK. And the talk will proceed as follows. I'm going to outline some of the main thematic findings from my fieldwork with those seeking asylum and living in destitution in the East End of London. So these are people who've applied for asylum in the UK for refugee status, and they've been rejected and have ended up in a cycle of appeals. And they're existing outside of any state support, without a right to work, and therefore with no means for survival and support. So they exist in the context of genuine destitution. Many of whom have also been in and out of immigration detention. Secondly, I will then move on to relate the insights of my fieldwork interviewees to those thoughts that I have found in Augustine's notion of evil as privation of the good and Weil's focus on the history of force and its overcoming. So to talk about my fieldwork. 3 years ago, I was invited to undertake a series of fieldwork interviews by the Jesuit Refugee Service in London, a Catholic NGO working with destitute asylum seekers. The project supports about 250 people living without resolved immigration status, denied a right to work, and without recourse to public funds, many of whom, but not all, have spent time in and out of immigration detention and under the threat of long-term suspended non-status or imminent removal from the UK. So people in this category fear both that they will forever end up with unresolved status or that they might be removed at any moment with very little notice. To give a little context, the UK has had the power to detain for immigration purposes since the 1970s when it introduced this legislation, but in fact it was very little used for many years. And it's really only over the last 20, 25 years that we've seen this really quick growth, which is a global phenomenon, in the use by the state of immigration detention. So in the UK, we have about 3,000 bed spaces a night that are used for immigration detention purposes. And it's a very significant for-profit industry in the UK, funded, of course, from the public purse. So the Jesuit Refugee Service in the UK runs a day centre, offers hot food, legal advice, advocacy, prayer groups, basic travel vouchers, toiletries, pastoral accompaniment, and a space to meet with others going through the same process. Now, one of the key features of the work of this NGO is that they enable refugees to be volunteers in the service so that refugee peer support is possible, and refugee volunteers are enabled to use their skills and to develop new skills and capacities rather than simply being passive recipients. So it draws on and develops the skills of those who are frustrated by a lack of a right to work. Using St. Augustine's idea that the good is always that which is primary and evil is simply the process through which we lose or repress that good, I structured my interviews by asking refugees about the basic primary goods that they valued in their lives and that they pursued in everyday contexts of adversity. I talked to them about the structural blocks or privations that frustrated their ability to pursue those goods while they were going through an asylum claim. It's important to make clear that those I interviewed felt that they were living in a system marked by many paradoxes. The system seemed to them to produce both stasis, i.e. a situation in which nothing seemed to change, and yet continued uprootedness. None of the features of a rooted life seemed possible to sustain. On the one hand, they felt that they experienced isolation, and yet, on the other hand, social dependency. They felt they experienced exclusion from public life, but also an endlessly publicly determined existence without privacy. These are the paradoxes that mark their experiences. In this context, the Jesuit Refugee Service felt like a kind of alternative civil community, a survival and gift exchange. one that could not overcome the system, but could at least provide an alternative logic to the logic of privation that interviewees felt so subjected to. In the course of the interviews, 3 key insights were offered to me by those I spoke to, and I'm going to outline those now. Firstly, the first theme or insight is about the distortion of time and temporality. Refugees repeatedly described to me the negative impact of the duration of claims, in other words, the time it takes to get a decision. Secondly, of poor casework judgments, which generated long appeals. And thirdly, of the enforced idleness created by the prohibition on work. And then also the administrative use of immigration detention without time limit in the UK as a tool for border management. Most European countries have a time limit of about 28 days. The UK detains without time limit. So we're an outlier in Europe in terms of our immigration detention practice. What was striking was the description of the impact of these practices as a distortion of healthy perceptions of being persons in time. Interviewees described the simultaneous process of the compression of time and yet the anxiety created by an acute sense of time passing. To quote, waiting, reporting, not working, the manner of treatment, sometimes in charities as well as by the Home Office or lawyers, dehumanises, it destroys us. Destitution makes us go mad, end of quote. Beginning of the next quote. Without structure, you become susceptible to lots of things. Isolation, criminality, addiction, mental and physical illnesses, end of quote. Others used the striking and disturbing image of physical decomposition to express to me their experience of destitution and detention. One said, quote, I feel as if I am degrading in time, end of quote. One former detainee speaking to an expert panel, so outside of my interview process, describes the extreme distorting effect that detention has on perceptions of time. Quote, in prison, you count your days down, but in detention, you count your days up, end of quote. That was repeated to me again and again as a major source of trauma, the difference between knowing the end point and counting up from the beginning with this openness of horizon. These insights have parallels with language used by a poet colleague of mine working on our refugee host project in the Middle East. Yusuf Kwasmeh writes poetry based on his experience and knowledge of growing up in a Palestinian refugee camp on the north coast of Lebanon. I visited the camp and indeed Yusuf's family. He writes of the refugee camp experienced as, quote, time more than place. He writes about the distorting effect on human beings when their sense of time is disordered or distorted. And he writes these very striking words, quote, in crucifying time, neither it nor we can recognise the crucified, end of quote. He's writing in a poetic medium. The views of those I interviewed echoed Yusuf's poetic insight. When we fail to live well in time ourselves, and through the use of force distort others' experiences of time, we become people who cannot recognise the face of suffering. To use the language of crucifixion as Yusuf does, and not merely suffering, is significant, I think. Crucifixion isn't something that just happens to someone. Crucifixion is never an accident, but always a decision. And I think these views have strong resonance with Pope Francis's words in his Lampedusa sermon of a few years ago, in which he talks about the disorientation of the settled in the face of migrant reality. So it's Europe that's disorientated, not the migrant populations who seek access to Europe and Europe's goods. So the second theme, the second analytical theme that came out of my interviews in the fieldwork context in London, the diminution, so the diminishing of skill and capacity brings with it an accompanying sense of dispossession. So as people feel their skills and capacities are diminished, so also there's an accompanying sense of personal dispossession. For those who had been detained, the experience was marked by a sense of dispossession and loss, a permanent sense of diminution. Quote, detention finishes people off. It's a form of mental trauma that takes away skill and capacity. We see this in people who have been highly skilled before. By the way, this quote is from somebody who herself is a refugee, had a medical background, now has her status and is working with other refugees who still don't have their status, so other people still seeking asylum. So she's saying detention finishes people off. It's a form of mental trauma that takes away skill and capacity. We see this in people who've been highly skilled before, doctors, dentists, nurses, university teachers, but who can't function in these roles even when they later achieve status, because they never fully recover from the trauma of detention, end of quote. In all my interviews, the trauma of detention was connected quite specifically to the use of force, the absence of a time limit, and the mimicking or parodying of a criminal justice process without real process that conveys the idea of a criminal act or intent that detainees, refugees cannot internalise or own as their own self-identity. One man told me, quote, the problem is the use of force, which shapes the whole reality. The system tells you in all its actions that you are an identity you cannot accept, end of quote. The theme of love denial was also central to the experience of other detainees. One interviewee, he'd been detained twice, the first for a year when he was 19, the second aged 21 for a period of months. He described the ways in which what he saw as the micro interactions of detention had profoundly altered his character as a person, producing a feeling of self-alienation and self-loathing. Having previously prided himself on being a gentle person, he explained that the system only responded to aggression. To get basic supplies of toiletries, you had to demand, to become rude, even aggressive. He noted the sense of self-loathing that he felt at the realisation that following the second period of detention, he had emerged from detention no longer able to feel a naturally empathetic reaction to the suffering of others, and no longer able to trust the motivations of anyone, including previously trusted family members. He described to me his distress at realising this shift in his own character. He felt on reflection that this was a result of both internalising the aggression and the suspicion that the system had enacted and expected of him, and a deep inner despair and sense of abandonment that he himself had felt in detention. He described the painful process of trying to retrain himself in empathetic instincts a year after his release. Similar descriptions about the long-term diminution in skill and capacity were repeated also by those living in enforced destitution. Repeatedly, I was told that the system seems deliberately geared to manufacture hopelessness. On the one hand, this hopelessness relates to the stasis of the system, its stuckness and its non-responsiveness. On the other hand, it relates to what a number of interviewees describe as the disciplinary structure of the system. One interviewee describes the way that the system feels like it quite deliberately aims to foster a self-identity in the asylum claimant that's the opposite of all the things that enabled refugee flight in the first place. Quote, fleeing takes enterprise, courage, determination, judgment. We see ourselves as having these characteristics, but the system creates a sense of ourselves as the opposite of these things. End of quote, beginning of new quote. The system makes us in its own image, end of quote. This gap between the enterprise of flight and the enforced dependence created by the system leaves an acute sense of affliction and disconnection from a healthy self-identity. Interviewees describe the ways that the system increases rather than limits the sense of dependence on others or awareness that one is vulnerable and a drain on other people. With some anger, one interviewee argued, quote, They want to shape the image of asylum seekers. You want to make a particular kind of community, meaning pointing at me as the interviewer, you want to make a particular kind of community with asylum seekers shaped in that image. The limits that you place on us, on pursuing what is important to us, to being human, are about seeking to destroy something. She continued, quote, "The system shapes your life in such a way that it means that you live with no love, no life. Relationships require stability. The system ensures that I have no stability," end of quote. One interviewee expresses this sense of the deliberate frustration of hope as follows, quote, "A capitalist system values the idea of contribution. You need to contribute to get something out. When you're not contributing in the way society understands contribution, you don't feel like a member of society. This is deliberate. They, the Home Office, know what they're doing," end of quote. He continues, quote, "This isn't just a form of social death, but also intellectually you suffer and die because you can't engage, participate or contribute. People don't take this into account when thinking about destitution and about what the asylum sets out to do, but it's crucial to understand," end of quote. Now, my third theme that emerged from the fieldwork. Resistance comes through finding and creating spaces of appearance in which nurturing promise, care and contribution are vital. Each interviewee talked to me about the ways that they had found to recreate the privacy, the publicness, the participation, the temporary rootedness and the community that was denied to them by the system. Crucially, the worlds that they had recreated had emerged from connections of care and hospitality given and received. What was crucial was not just receiving charity, welfare, hospitality, but also the opportunities to give and exchange those in communities. Several detainees had saved the lives of fellow suicidal detainees inside immigration detention facilities. Others had volunteered and had secured some sense of well-being in their communities through being able to find contributing roles in secular and religious institutions. One of the things I don't have time to talk about here today too much, but I should mention, is the significance of churches, of mosques, at providing an alternative space of membership and citizenship where people felt that they could take on leadership roles, they could have a sense of citizenship in their faith communities that they couldn't have in a secular political cultural space. I asked no direct questions about religiosity in my interviews. However, all but one interviewee talked about the importance of religious practices and traditions for their resilience and survival. The same single scripture passage, Jeremiah 29, Letter to the Exiles, was quoted to me several times. Quote, this is a quote of one interviewee rendering the passage from Jeremiah 29, quote, "God says that there are plans I have for you, plans for your welfare and not for your harm. He says the plan I have for you is for unexpected ends," end of quote. Another told me that in the context of what he felt to be a radical denial of love in immigration detention, he had discovered through being deprived of a sense of love at an external level that he had a radical love within him and had become determined upon release to create a legacy of love himself in defiance of what he had experienced. Others talked about a deep sense of learning and care in adversity and viewed what had happened to them and the hospitality that they had received from JRS as a kind of preparation for something that lay ahead in their futures, where they would offer the same care in return to others, a sense of promise that would manifest itself at a later point. And so now I want to return to my two opening quotations to try and find ways that theology can do dialogue with the kind of insights that my interviewees had offered. So let's go back to that first quotation from Simone Weil, and I'm going to read it again. "The essential contradiction of the human condition is that man is subject to force and craves for justice. He is subject to necessity and craves for the good. It is not his body alone that is the subject, but all his thoughts as well. And yet man's very being consists of straining towards the good. End of quote from Simone Weil, written in the 1940s, and reflecting on the Iliad, on Homer's Iliad. Simone Weil wrote these words in perhaps her single most luminous piece of writing, her essay on Homer's Iliad, and she writes again about it in a series of fragments of writing in the mid-1940s. Weil reads the poem as a story of the history of force, based on refugee memory. She argues that the Iliad narrates two forms of continuous history, the history of force and the history of hospitality. She is interested in how we enact a reflective interval that creates a space for hospitality and justice to erupt or rupture the logic of force. So she sees hospitality and justice happening in this reflective interval, the moment when the sword can be held back for a moment and we can think about what we're really doing. She thinks that those two continuous histories run side by side, the continuous history of force and the continuous history of a reflective interval that breaks into that history. Force, she argues, holds all in its power. It can be possessed by none. It intoxicates its supposed master and it destroys its victim. Yet Weil does not imagine love and force as simply an opposing binary, an either or. Love on the one hand, force on the other. Nor does she think in more Marxist terms of love and force as a productive dialectic. We need suffering in order for good and truth to emerge. She doesn't think those things. Rather, she views suffering and force as simply what is, part of the givenness of things. Weil wants us to learn to dwell as deeply and unsentimentally as possible in the givenness and the limit of the world, where what is most real is to be found through critical attention to what she calls gravity, that is, everything that pulls us downwards, limits and constrains us, is part of the difficulty of material life, and on the other hand, grace. So gravity and grace. And both gravity, everything that limits us and we experience as difficulty and necessity, both gravity and grace, beauty and truth and blessing are equally real. And both, she says, seem equally impossible to us. The idea that we should suffer and the idea that grace should transform our lives, both of them are faces of the impossible in different ways. They uses the Iliad to stress that we are obligated to attend to, rather than allow our minds to shrink from, the history of force. So another thing that Weil thinks in her writings is that the human mind naturally recoils from suffering. We pull away, we want to not think about it, we shrink from it. There's a kind of cowardice in the face of it. We'd rather look somewhere else. But she says, effectively, we're obliged to attend, to not give in to our minds wanting to shrink away from the history of force and its invasive misery. Indeed, she goes as far as to argue that only those who are able to measure the dominion of force, to look it in the face, and then this is the critical phrase, and know how not to respect it, is capable of love and justice. So the full quote, just to read that. Only he who has measured the dominion of force and knows how not to respect it is capable of love and justice. End of quote. Reflecting on the insights of my interviewees, I found the resonances with Weil's canon of writing stark and striking. Weil describes a form of suffering which she calls affliction, the limit case of suffering, in which the suffering involves not only pain, but also the erosion of the self, the pulverizing of the mind, of the body and the soul. So if I have a stomach flu, that's suffering, but it doesn't pulverize my mind, body and soul. Affliction, she argues, is, quote, not a psychological state. It is the pulverization of the soul by the mechanical brutality of circumstances, end of quote. This is the kind of suffering in which, quote, the event which has gripped and uprooted a life attacks it, directly or indirectly, in all its parts, social, psychological, and physical, end of quote. She locates the reason for this fragmentation in the privation of the good enacted, which separates basic human needs from their satisfaction. This kind of affliction is not simply brutality, what she calls the impact of the blow, but rather the gradual erosion of, quote, the ability to make decisions, to possess one's time and one's body, to plan for the future. Each of those phrases, that in affliction one loses the ability to make decisions, to possess one's time and one's body, and to plan for the future, that they divorce thought from the thinker. That felt to me exactly what my interviews were describing by way of their own suffering. I outlined a moment ago the ways that they, writing on the Iliad and writing in her London Fragments, imagines force as a perennial social relation and necessarily a constant subject of analysis. In her writing on Roots in the 1940s, Weil returns to these themes, but now in the context of uprootedness, forging a connection between processes of what she calls derealization and force. She argues that creating a sense of uprootedness in human beings, this deep sense of dislocation at all levels, political, social, psychological, etc., depends on the denial of the real. So uprootedness as a social process begins where a political force or entity or cultural force denies the real. Social processes that deprive human persons of a notion of reality, that deny what they have experienced, uproot. My interviewees described both the methods of extracting and cultivating acceptable refugee stories and the use of criminal processes to manage a non-criminal justice process, for example, in the case of immigration detention, as well as hostile social messaging, as a forceful process of derealization, where what they know through their own experience, they're told is in some way unreal, and a social narrative around its unreality is created. Forced territorial expulsion and the refoulement of refugees, which is illegal in international law, are the limit cases of such derealization of what exists. In her writings on human personality, Weil turns to a third theme that pushes further this idea of force. She argues for the inherent impersonal connection that the human mind forges between the good and the sacred. So we're very used to the idea that what we should protect is what's personal to an individual, the thisness of this person, the fact that Professor Clark is uniquely Professor Clark. And for a minute, Simone Weil wants us to disturb this idea that what we should be committed to is simply the uniqueness of each person. She wants us to talk about what is universally true, this impersonal connection that connects you and me and Professor Clark and everybody else. And this is a connection between the good and the sacred. She argues, what is universally sacred is the expectation that good will be done to a person and not harm, which, by the way, makes the destruction of hope in a person a particular offence against the sacred. Quote, the good is the only source of the sacred. There is nothing sacred except the good and what pertains to it. The eruption of dereliction and anger at harm from the human soul and its angry cry, why, is because the sacred roots our expectation of something other than that harm, of care. Weil believes that it is the impersonal, what is universally expected by the human person, that roots our obligations to respond. This account found profound echo to my mind in the response of those interviewees that I spoke to in London, to their knowledge that the system aimed not to produce the maximum justice for them, but the system seemed geared deliberately to the destruction of hope as the grounds for deterrence for other refugee journeys and claims. This knowledge created a cry of why and a grounded sense of deep harm beyond the question of the mere brutality of treatment. For these reasons, I have found Weil's writings a profound echo from her own refugee experience to the refugee experience of those I interviewed. Weil speaks of the paradox of the longing for the good and the way we strive no matter what to recreate what is lost to us, but also of the offence against the sacred that this represents for the person when it's frustrated. She talks of force as a historical subject and of the requirement that anyone who wishes to speak of love and justice be willing to look the history of force in the face first and then speak. Now I want to look at the second quote in conclusion from St. Augustine. So to remind you of that second quotation, I'll read it again. And it's a quotation from Rowan Williams summarising St. Augustine. Talking about evil is talking about a process, about something that happens to the things that there are in the universe. Evil is not some kind of object, but we give the name of evil to that process in which the good is lost. End of quote. If Simone Weil helps us think about both the endless yearning for the good and force as a perennial social relation that we must be willing to confront in our journey towards the good, then Augustine helps us to think more about how the good comes to be lost to us in social terms. Augustine's notion of evil holds that evil is without substance. Evil is a negation or a privation, a lack, a loss of being and goodness. What is evil does not have being in itself. It's not a real force in itself with substance, but rather evil is always parasitic on what is and what is good. So evil is kind of like a parasite. It is only ever the distortion of something real. Evil resides, therefore, in a disordered good. The claim that evil is a form of non-being should not be confused with a proposition that evil is just an illusion, nor a claim that evil is felt in empirical terms as anything other than the deepest of agonies. It's not an attempt to wash away or water down evil. Rowan Williams narrates Augustine's argument again in this further language, quote, and this is on the slide. If evil itself is never a subject or a substance, the only way in which it can be desired or sought is by the exercise of the goods of mental and affective life, the emotional life, swung around by error to a vast misapprehension, a mistaking of the unreal and the groundless for the real. The more such a pursuit continues, this misapprehension, the more the desiring subject becomes imprisoned, enslaved, hemmed in, the more the typical excellences of the will and intelligence are eroded. However, that does not mean that the efforts of this nightmare error are lessened. Here Rowan Williams expounds Augustine's view that sin and evil gain their force not merely as a move from focusing on higher to lower goods, but through a continual process in which the good and what is evil is misrecognised and becomes embedded as a lack of the good through the sheer force of habit. What we experience as evil, therefore, is not so much a lack, but what we experience is the effect of a lack. Quote, the habitual displacement of true by untrue perception, close brackets. In Book 7 of the Confessions, Augustine emphasises a repeated theme in his theology, that a failure to grasp the good and a willingness to fall into evil manifests an improper or distorted form of seeing. So this is now about the way in which we see in the wrong way. A distorted visualization of God and a distorted visualization of ourselves as human creatures results. Again, the parallels here with Pope Francis's teaching on the failure to see and hear the neighbour, this disorientation, devisualization, is striking. This process of losing the good is, of course, not an invisible process, but rather one that is traceable and visible in the life of concrete institutions and real everyday social practices. We can chart the loss of the good as a reality open to critique. As I thought about this account of evil as privation of the good and listened to the experiences of those I was interviewing, I was struck by a number of correspondences that I want to share with you. Firstly, Augustine shows the ways that the Manichees, who he was disagreeing with and refuting, saw evil as a real, invasive, alien moral other, as something having substance, and Augustine's disagreeing with this. This language of evil as real, invasive, and an alien moral other is strikingly resonant with the public representation of forced migrants today. Clearly, one cultural option is simply to reverse this trope and argue that migrants are not an invasive moral other, to argue for the virtue of migrants. Another favoured option is to reject such morally loaded terminology of vice or virtue on either side, and instead to just talk in more realist or pragmatic terms. What I am suggesting, applied to the case of immigration detention, is a third approach in which we take Augustine's nuanced vision of this language seriously as a challenge to really think about what we're doing concretely in the life of institutions, to think about the purposes of public practices and the processes that they enact. This is where Weil and Augustine take us, to paying concrete attention to what we are actually doing, the concrete kinds of cooperation with or frustration of basic goods in our everyday interactions. The second observation or connection I was making in my mind with regards to Augustine. Augustine gives us, I think, helpful language for doing something other than simply shouting at the world that something is evil or bad. His theology of evil, this very subtle theology of evil, which sees evil as parasitic on the good, calls us to pay very close attention to how problematic structures, and I'm thinking about immigration detention here, but we could think about others, put to use certain forms of human excellence, but in a distorted form. It's very striking to me that in ethnographic work conducted by criminologists in the UK with staff who work in detention facilities, a number of things that correspond to that Augustinian analysis of making use of excellences towards bad ends are strikingly true. In the work of Mary Bosworth, based at Oxford University, both staff and detainees struggle for a language to capture the experience, expressing a lostness for words when they're pushed to articulate the moral purpose of immigration detention. Staff working in the detention estate struggle to explain the moral value of their work. Under pressure to make it meaningful, they resort to bureaucratic languages of process and contract. Indeed, public documents which try and talk about the value or purpose of immigration detention constantly oscillate, rebrand, reinvent themselves, and do not have a stable narrative. It seems that there is no real ability to articulate stable core goods in the case of immigration detention. That's interesting in its own right, I think. However, and this is the more Augustinian point, when staff are asked about their work on a day-to-day basis, they talk with pride about the excellences that they bring to their work, trying to be human and relational and taking pride in this, being a good manager or administrator, and so forth. These are the excellences swung round the wrong way, the excellences put to work in the context of a system that structures a wider privation of the good and cannot articulate itself in moral terms. And the system relies parasitically on these goods. Drawing from Augustine and Simone Weil, what I want to suggest in this lecture today is that evil can be understood as the effect of aiming at disordered goods, and that such an account raises a series of concrete questions about the good in the case of immigration detention. What goods are aimed at as positive goals by those creating and enforcing detention? And how do we subject these to evaluation? Which instrumental goods are being used as the means to manufacture and enforce detention as a practice? Which excellences is the system reliant on? And what do we think about the deployment of those excellences for those ends? Which goods reveal themselves to be suppressed when we measure the answers to the first two questions in the light of detainees' own expertise by experience? Such questions help us to consider which goods might be considered disordered in the case of immigration detention as currently practiced. Detainees speak of the disordering of basic goods latent in the practice of detention. They talk about these disordered basic goods in terms of frustrated communication, failed solidarities, the denial of family ties, the lack of a possibility for work, the frustration of access to law, the regulation of bodily activity, the lack of freedom of movement and association. In place of these desired basic goods, detention is seen as marked by practices of non-communication, which aim to generate fear, increase compliance, are based on the use of spatial isolation, which aim to break down networks of human solidarity, to create distance between non-citizen and citizen networks of support in order to increase compliance with removal or case rejection. They also seem to be rooted in practices which lead to the physical breakdown of the human mind and body. In this sense, detainees describe immigration detention as reproducing the experience of exile and strangerhood, becoming a stranger to oneself as well as others. That this is what the system of detention creates as the basis for compliance with territorial expulsion, with minimizing territorial access, and with a lack of integration during lengthy decision-making processes. Given the fact that detainees report a sense of active evil in their experience of detention, and detainees did use that phrase with me, they talked about it as an experience of evil and darkness, it can be easy to miss a central Augustinian point, which we can derive from Book 19 of the City of God. To operate a system of detention requires us to use the excellences of human willing, intelligence, and reason to create structures that express primarily that which we imagine ourselves to be against. Such practices require institutions that articulate a sense of purpose and perpetuate themselves in the light of these perceived goods. In this sense, the system of immigration detention begs the question of the good and of excellences, which must therefore be open to reasoned challenge on the basis of both the harm it can be perceived to cause and the goods that it claims to serve. And we need to ask questions about that harm and those perceived goods. Staring these questions in the face in an unsentimental fashion is the task that I think Simone Weil would put before those of us who wish to speak with conviction of the love and the justice promised by the Gospels, of the welfare and not the harm promised to Jeremiah and his people in the letter to the exiles. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rowlands. For those who will be using this over the next couple of weeks while we are online, there are also some discussion questions to help us think about how we understand not only Simone Weil and St. Augustine, but also how this crisis of the politics of membership is affecting us here in the United States. Everything described as being the situation in the United Kingdom today is also the case, except sometimes on a much greater scale here in the United States, where there seems to be an even more rapid increase in the industry of detention that we are seeing not only at the southern border of the United States, but also within our communities scattered throughout the country. You will find on this slide discussion questions that can be used both individually and in groups, depending on how people are structuring, conducting class virtually. And you will also find as well an activity or assignment that can be used to help us make those connections more specifically and see this not just as something that is a matter for the United Kingdom or Europe, but also here in the United States. So I hope that everyone who will watch this afterwards gets as much out of this as I did. And I look forward to this being the first of many future conversations that hopefully we get to have as a St. John's community with Dr. Rowlands.
Thank you for having me.